No matter what kind of franchise it is, it may eventually be luckily or unluckily picked back up and taped together, as evidenced by, well, history. This is obviously seen many a times, even very recently. Whether it's Shaq Fu,
Here comes the money!
Here we go! I'm back and about to storm. Shaq Fu, a legend born.
or something like Ken Levine's BioShock. He initially didn't want to make a sequel to BioShock, but the corporate overlords wanted otherwise. Luckily 2K didn't mock it up. So where am I going with this? Well, how do some games get away with dozens upon dozens of entries? Final Fantasy or Mario or whatever kart racer you can really think of. Well, they all have a shared universe where the development process isn't limited to just sequels. Something as simple as item names spread across in each of the games will come off as a good thing. Whereas copying the same weapons in a shooter onto the next sequel will come off as lazy. And then, so what happens when you have relatability thrown into that? Well, you get Nintendo, and Nintendo hasn't evolved their games as undertones for decades. I'll throw Jak and Daxter as a decent example of moving towards a mature undertone. Instead of making Jak and Daxter 2 colored platforming harder, well, they made Jak 2, where they added a spin of real story progression and weapons and abilities among other things, obviously. It wasn't just riding the Grand Theft Auto trend train at the time, but the problem with this evolution is that it can go both ways. If a company tries to forcefully change its demographic or even fix something that didn't need fixing, well, you get all kinds of different results, let's say that. And then you have the ceiling of success where Need for Speed always comes to mind. You can't just annually attempt to replicate the biggest success of the franchise from like 10 years ago. So the effort has to be different and good in its own way. The reason why shooters always get bashed for being lazy or lacking creativity is precisely the reason as to why colorful platformers tend to never get called that. It's the kind of genre that it is, but it's also more difficult to do than it ever was because of how much creative freedom there is. So without this getting too one-dimensional, there is a sort of solution to this quote-unquote community backlash. There are also times where something popular gets called, "Why does this even have the same name?" of whatever franchise is being talked about. Obviously, if the game itself isn't good in its own way, it deserves that. But there have been a dozen times where something that gets unfairly called out. So I think people need to have a more open mind towards whatever project is being delivered. And you're probably asking for examples, but that's my point. You will be the judge yourself, and like everyone else has been thus far. But, again, one of the main culprits for this is journalism itself. There are many arbitrary quote-unquote critics that can sway people's opinions, so if anything you need to, again, keep an open mind. So if Nintendo hasn't evolved, Sony is definitely one to be more accepting of whatever route a franchise goes to. Microsoft would be more of a ditch and leave kind of company with their games, before even getting to the evolution part. Case in point there is the amount of times they tried to make a franchise exclusive, only for it not to be later on, especially with JRPGs during the last generation. And sure, Microsoft has a couple big franchises and they're damn good, but from a perspective of a consumer you'd probably expect a lot more. Lately this has only increased tenfold with the early access release of PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds. They're practically making you pay for an alpha version of a game. And this kind of behavior is just bad, and sure, every digital marketplace has their stinkers on there, but at least they don't really pull stunts like this, not very often. Especially considering that Sony doesn't even allow early access. But things will get through and be published or released. I could be biased in the sense that I just don't support early access as a concept, but the rabbit hole goes deeper than that. Realistically, do you want to pay up front for something that should be a free demo or a beta? I can make sense out of Kickstarter but not early access. But aren't they the same thing? Not really. One is straight up buying into promises and the other is straight up just buying into thin air. Granted, I'm not oblivious to the fact that good things can come out of early access and even evolve into a full-fledged game, but more often than not it either gets dumped or just never goes out of limbo. Kickstarter projects can end up having a similar result or even worse, like the scenario where the individual or individuals end up just taking the money and not delivering on anything at all. One more point of evolution is having spin-off titles. Sometimes they might mess with the canon or they might be standalone. But different doesn't always mean bad. Maybe you just don't like change or you do. But as long as something works standalone and doesn't compromise on overall quality, it has a right to exist. Whether a publisher has mishaps or has misjudged the competency or incompetency of a developer, the outcome is usually unfairly the same. They get shut down. And then maybe a decade later it gets revived to stalk your shadow or embrace you with open arms. So, onto a more final note. The debate of personal taste and opinions will obviously never end, but my opinion is that most opinions are usually obsolete. And my point here is that people should have more opinions of their own rather than jumping on a bandwagon just to shit on something.